Okay, class, we're doing today chapter 6. So, chapter 6, we are starting different parts of the course now. So, we're actually moving on to the macroeconomic part of economics. So, before this, we are talking about more like topics that pertain to microeconomics. So, microeconomics. Really, which is the chapter 1 to 5, and this would be 6. I think in our syllabus we do it all the way to chapter 10, if I remember correctly. But anyway, microeconomics topics pertain to decision makings from the part of the households, from the parts of the producers, consumers, and the government. So from chapter 6 onward, this chapter onward, we're dealing with macroeconomics. Macroeconomics deal with more like the big picture of the economy. So we'll talk about important topics such as GDP, gross domestic product, and then we'll talk about inflation. These are all very big topics. When you turn on the news on TV, you hear about all these numbers. So about the state of the economy, they indicate the performance of the economy. For example, the U.S. economy, what is the current GDP level as compared to China? So, and then we talk about recession, and then we talk about depression. So this is your chapter 6 topics. So how do you measure the economy? Like any given economy, how do you compare the economic performance of China versus United States, for example? So we use this thing called GDP. So that stands for gross domestic product. So basically what you're looking is you look at the big picture of all the production. What do you produce in the United States? Other than cowboy boots and cowboy hats, Yes, you produce, let's say, tobaccos in North Carolina, and then you also produce Microsoft. You export it to other countries. And what else? You produce healthcare, education. These are the services, banking industries. And of course, you produce computers. HP Hewlett Packard, for example, that's your Apple computers, all the Apple tablets and iPhones. All does it produce? So you add up all the industries, all the sectors in the economy, what they produce, you sum them all up. You add up the values in terms of dollar values. Does anybody know, like today, as we stand now, what is approximately, the GDP of the U.S.? So it's roughly about 17 trillion. Dollars. This is in US dollars. And you know what? China is growing so fast. It's trying to catch up with the United States. In fact, GDP. In fact, a few years ago, I think it was a couple of years ago, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, did a prediction that China will catch up as to US as number one GDP producer in the whole world. So, but it hasn't happened yet. I think it's close, but it's not happening yet. Okay. And so when you look at this GDP, one of the key concepts you want to drive home is that it's not social welfare. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on. And so when you look at GDP, again, you are measuring, so there is the definition. So let's write down that definition. And according to your textbook, GDP is the dollar values of all. Actually, I'm going to add the word finance, goods and services So the word final goods and services, you're not looking at the intermediate good, but you're looking at the finished product that you send to, you ship to or you sold to the end users, consumers that is. Like if you go to Best Buy and buy a computer, you do not want to buy them in parts. You want to bring the computer home and plug it in and start running. Likewise, if you buy a car, you do not want to go out and buy the trunk today and tomorrow you come back and buy the doors and then the next day you get all the tires. No such thing. You buy a car, you want to drive away. The finished product, the final products. Okay, the dollar values of all the final goods and services produced in the United States, in the U.S., in a year. So typically we measure it annually. So we might say in 2016, what is the United States GDP? And in 2015, what was it? So you measure it in terms of annual value. So the final sales of goods and services, as I said, it's the final goods and services, not the intermediate good or services. You do not want to buy them in parts. You want to buy the finished products. Okay, let's see, what's the other one? Okay, and this has to have some kind of market activity. Produce and, I think I'll add the word produce and sold in the United States. In other words, here, the word sale here implies that it has to go through a market transaction. For example, if you're making a bookshelf for your mother on Mother's Day, you're going to present it to her as a gift. You put in all your time. It took you 3 months to make that bookcase or bookshelf. And finally, on Mother's Day, you present it to her, and it's worth about $500, the market value. But you're not going to charge your mother $500 on Mother's Day when you present to her as a gift. So gift is not counted because it doesn't go to the market at all. There's no market transaction. Your mother is not gonna. You're not gonna ask your mother to pay for it, and you issue a receipt. So therefore, that is not counted. So, like for example, husband and wife. Husband work outside home, and housewives stay at home and take care of baby, do the laundry, cook the dinner. So by the time husband comes home, you're not gonna say, honey, you owe me $352.55. No such thing, because the home workers or your homemakers, the work is not going through market transactions, so therefore it's not counted as all. So it's volunteer service. As long as there's no receipt being issued or anything like that, it's not counted. It's informal. So produce, meaning that it has to be produced in that year. So for example, right, and within the U.S. border. So for example, the books say, if you produce Honda or Toyota in the U.S., yes, that's going to be counted. But if you produce if Microsoft is being produced in Mexico, that's not going to be counted because it's outside the U.S. border. So the other thing to keep in mind is the word produce. So it has to be produced in a given year. So therefore, you're not counting anything that's secondhand or used, because in the year that it was produced, it was already counted. For example, if you buy a used car today and it costs you like $5,000, so is that going to go to this year's GDP? The answer is no, because it was already counted when it was produced 10 years ago, because that was 2006 model, for example. So you're not going to count it one more time. However, if it involves car sellers, agents, commissions, that's going to be counted. So likewise, if you buy a house, a lot of time you buy a house that are not newly built, that are already in existence. So if you buy a Victorian home that's 100 years old, you're not going to, and you pay 200,000 for it, and that's not going to count towards this year's GDP because it was already counted when it was produced 100 years ago. However, if you hire a real estate agent to help you to close the sale, and this agent's commission will be counted as service for this year's GDP. So just keep in mind some of those things here. And of course, GDP does not capture the stock market prices as well. That's not considered as part of your GDP. So what do we do? What you do is you use a market basket of goods, and you use a base here. So what happened is, so that's basically it, yeah. So next we move on to inflation. So this is the first one, second, third, and yeah. So the second concept that I would like to cover is inflation. So in the case of inflation, we use some sort of price index. Now, if you do not know what inflation is, usually a good indication of when you have inflation is when you drive up to the gas pump. So how many of you have to drive to go to work? Probably just about everybody, most of us. So when you drive to work, right, you have to put in gas, in order for the car to run. And every day you drive by the gas station, you look at the price, you say, oh yeah, what's today's price? Has it gone up or has it gone down? You wish it's going down each day. But if it has been going up, that means it's an indication that, and if it has been going up and up and up all the time, so there's probably a good indication that there is inflation coming. So with inflation, there are a few things that I would like for you to make sure that you get it. The first concept is Consumer Price Index, what we call CPI. So that stands for Consumer Price Index. So this is a measurement that we use to measure inflation. Okay, for example, you look at the CPI in 2016. So then you look at the price of market basket, so I'll define that in just a minute, and 2016 divided by the same thing in base year. So this market basket is, it's a basket of goods and services that most people consume on a daily basis. For example, cell phone will probably be a good one. Hamburgers, your rent for 2-bedroom apartment. So how they compute this price is they go around doing consumer survey, and ask from household to household, like how much do you pay for hamburgers today? In today's price, and what is your 2-bedroom apartment cost? How much rent do you pay, and what are your cell phone subscription price? So you use the same standard basket of goods, and then you compare across the years. Every year you ask the same question, and that's how you compute it. So this things that goes into market basket has to be very representative of a given average consumer. So next, what is a base year? Now, base year, I'm going to give you my definition. This is a year that's that is free of any economic disturbances. So these are some of the years that you want to use. You don't want to use base year. The years that you have very high unemployment rate, like the Great Depression or the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, to be your base year. So you stay clear from all this high inflation rate and high unemployment rate. For example, you do not want to use September 11, when did that happen, 2001 as a base year, because that's a bad year in terms of U.S. economy. So pick a year that's representative, that is free of any economic disturbances. Nothing bad. in terms of economic event. So that's how you calculate the CPI. So basically, CPI, the base year will be 1, and anything above 1 will indicate that there is inflation. So in a nutshell, this is your so-called inflation. And how do you measure the inflation rate? Basically, you take the percentage change between the 2 years. You look at the CPI for given 2 years, and then you divide it by the first year. So if the 2 years, right? Let me write it down for you. So if you have your slide, that will be on your slide number 7. So inflation will be to look at the CPI in year 2 minus CPI in year 1 divided by the original year, which is basically CPI in year 1. And you have to remember to multiply by 100 because this is inflation rate you're calculating between the 2 years. So some of the problems of measuring inflation is there are 2 types of problems here. Number 1, quality adjustment. Number 2, substitution adjustment. So a lot of the time when you measure standard basket of goods and services, you see, consumer electronics, you go through a cycle, they advance so fast. So pretty soon you come up with iPhone 5 and then iPhone 6, iPhone 7. It kept changing, right? Same thing with tablets. You have so many models, and every 18 months, that's a cycle. You get new products. So it's kind of hard to have a fixed market basket, especially pertaining to electronic goods here. So because the quality is different, iPhone 6 is much better than iPhone 4, for example. And nobody could argue about that, because you upgrade it, you make it better each time. So one of the problems of measuring inflation rate using this standard basket of goods is you fail to take into consideration this quality adjustment, or even to some extent substitution. Next, I want to talk about so a lot of time, because of these problems that we experience, which you could see in slide number 8, we say that the CPI, Consumer Price Index, basically overstates the cost of living by about 0.8%. So this is one of the problems here. And a few, again, I'm looking at slide number 10. So another thing that you should be familiar with is the word core, CPI. What exactly it is that this is a CPI that you exclude 2 categories of goods, and this is exclude food and energy costs. Because historically, if you look at inflation, right, the inflations are high usually because of energy prices being high. Look at the first and second oil shocks during the early 70s and late 70s. So it's because, and lately in the last few years, you have seen that the food prices have gone up. So, but if you look at core CPI, right, or core inflation, you could see that the inflation is rather stable because, you're not taking into account food and energy. But if you look at food and energy, oh yeah, they fluctuate a lot. So now if you refer to your book and specifically your slide number 11, you could see that if you revert back to calculate using this core CPI, you can see that, oh yeah, it's very stable. It's not fluctuating too much. But if you look at the regular CPI, you can see that fluctuation is high and low. So what we're saying is sometimes you also calculate this core CPI to take out the effects of food and energy prices on the inflation. You see that, oh yeah, we're not doing so bad. We're quite stable in terms of inflation. Um, so next, I would also want to introduce a word COLA, C-O-L-A. And again, this is in your slide number 13. So what is COLA? It stands for cost of living adjustment. And this is a device that compensates people for the fact that inflation makes the spending power of their income less. So we all hear the word that inflation eats up our money. For example, when you go to McDonald's today, you order a Big Mac. You could finish it in a few bites, you know, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I remember the Big Mac was huge and thick, you know. It takes you longer time. You had to open your mouth bigger because the hamburger, the Big Mac was thicker, much thicker. So anyway, that's inflation. Yeah, you pay more or less the same the current dollar value, but you know you get less of it. So next, we want to talk about who are the winners and who are the losers of inflation. So winner versus losers. Let me erase some of this thing. Let me rewrite that again. Now, there are winners and losers of inflation because basically if there is inflation going on, the money that you receive is going to be less unless you factor into your wage contract, that is. Okay, let me give you an example here. So you got the winners and then you have the losers. So let's use a term unexpected inflation. Now, if inflation comes upon you like suddenly, like the oil shock year, so it means you experience a shock. It means it happens suddenly. So basically, if you're getting your wages from your boss, your employees, and you're receiving wages from your employer, so when you get it, you know, hey, the value is less because of inflation. So we are the loser, people who works, the workers or the employees. And the employers are the winners. On the other hand, there are borrowers and lenders. Like if you borrowed money from the bank, like you're paying off your mortgages for your houses. So then basically in this case we say that we are the winner. The borrowers are the winners. The lenders are the loser. And why? Because every month you have to pay mortgages, your monthly mortgages to your banks. So when they get your money, has got less value because of inflation. So they are the loser. And this is only true if the inflation is unexpected. But if they expect the inflation to be coming, and you know, the banks are always one step ahead of us. So if they expect it coming, then they will probably do some adjustment on the interest rate. And then we would be the loser. They will be the winner. That is, if inflation is expected. For the most case, we don't know when it is coming, then the banks are the loser, we are the winner. Because when they get our monthly mortgages, you know, the money is actually less. Okay, so okay. The other thing that I would want to, somehow this is like not in the right order. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the term real GDP and nominal GDP. So there are certain problems with somehow your slides started off with GDP and then it talks about inflation. Now it's coming back to GDP here. So now we're back to GDP. So I'm following the order of your slides here. So the word deflating, GDP. So basically what you do is there are two types of GDP. One is real versus nominal GDP. So when you say you deflate GDP, that means you take into account inflation. So that's called a real GDP. So in other words, you will have to divide your nominal GDP by some sort of index, like consumer index, price index, to get to your real GDP. So for example, let me give you an example here. So your real GDP would be, you would take your nominal GDP divided by your CPI. Okay? And this process is known as deflating. Deflating means you take the nominal value of anything, household income, GDP divided by CPI to derive at a real GDP. So in other words, what this is really saying is real GDP or real household incomes or wages or what have you, you have taken into consideration the inflation, the effects of inflation, the impact of inflation. You're nominalizing it. Okay, there's some problem of using this real GDP because remember I talked about it earlier that it does not take into account, household trying to use that term. It does not take into account informal sectors of the economy. Like if you have a plumbing problem, you get your Uncle Bob to come by and fix your commode might be leaking. So at the end of the day, he's done his service, he's not going to charge you anything, but you might give him a token. What we call just $5 here, so you could get some coffee, but that's not a real value. But you're giving him a token, so we're not counting that because he's not going to issue you a receipt for that. So you do not count any home production. You do not look at the value of the leisure time, for example. You do not look at the composition of the output because you look at the final value, not the intermediate value. And you do not look at the underground economy, informal sector, like all this illegal transaction that goes on, you're selling drugs, and you're not going to ask them to issue a receipt for that because, you get into trouble, if you're selling drugs. So all this are not being accounted for. So next I want to move on to the third one, which is unemployment. So what exactly is considered unemployed? A person is considered unemployed if you are actively looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. So in order to calculate unemployment, so in the first place, if you're 16 years old and older, so you'll be classified into 3 categories. Number one, you are either employed, you got a job, either part-time or full-time, or you are unemployed. Unemployed means you have to be actively looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. So if not, you're not classified as you're classified as out of the labor force. So in order to calculate the unemployment rate, so really what you're looking at is you're looking at the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. So your labor force is basically equals to the number of unemployed plus number of employed. Okay, so and then we say there are 3 types of unemployment. So this is in your slide number 22. So the first one is known as frictional unemployment. So I'm going to use U/E to use a short form. It's my short form or acronym for unemployment. So the second one is known as structural unemployment. Third one is known as seasonal. And then the last one is known as cyclical unemployment. Okay, frictional unemployment is unavoidable. You will have it in any economy, even though your unemployment rate is considered, good. So there is no such a thing as negative unemployment rate. Now, in terms of inflation, you could get deflation or negative inflation, but not so with unemployment rate. It has to be above zero, positive number. In fact, it has to be above zero. It can't be zero because you will always have frictional unemployment. What is it? It is something that there will be a transition period where you're trying to find a better job, better match job. So, and that's good for the economy because that means the economy is always moving, it's dynamic. So I will put a smiling face here. So this is a good kind of unemployment. Usually it's temporary. Now, structural unemployment refer to a change in the structure of the labor force. For example, in the turn of the centuries, I think around 30s, you have steel workers that were being laid off for a period of time. And that's not like forever. So after a couple years or so, they are being rehired into the industry again. So that's kind of it's got something to do with the structure of the workforce. Another contribution to that structural unemployment has got to do with your skill. Like you're not having enough skill. For example, if you do not have skill of speaking English, you can get a job in this country. Then we say that they could take English class, because it's correctable. This kind of structural unemployment can be corrected through training. You give them English classes, or same thing as computing skill. If you don't have computing skill, like people who are older, the older generation, if they want to get any jobs today, a lot of time it requires some sort of computing skill. Okay, so if they don't have that kind of skill, you could give them computer classes, training. So then they would be trained, hopefully trainable. Seasonal unemployment, that's farming is probably a good, example of that because farming is typically seasonal. So the kind of people that you hire on the farm, and during off season, you're not growing anything. You lay off these people. Well, you let them go, for a period of time, and then next year they come back again in the summer or in the spring, because in the winter time nobody produces anything. Now, cyclical unemployment, I'm going to put a sad face here because this one relates to recession. In fact, if you look at Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 and the Great Recession more recently, 2007 to 2009, 2010, you could see that during these two periods of a Great Recession or Great Depression, cyclical unemployment is basically has to do with that. You will see that your unemployment rate were extremely high. Okay, so one of the things that I'll talk about regarding the measurement or unemployment rate is a group of people called discouraged workers. So sometimes we say we understate unemployment rate. We say that the unemployment rate could have been higher because a lot of time we do not measure these people who are known as discouraged workers, but there's a big percentage of these people out there, but unfortunately the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, does not measure these people. But if you factor these people in, you actually have a higher unemployment rate because the BLS definition for discouraged workers, remember to measure unemployment, to be unemployed, you have to be actively looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. There are people who give up, they get discouraged. They still have the intention to want to work, but they have quit going out and look for a job beyond that 4 weeks. we're not counting those people. So what some economists argue is you should count them, because if you count them, our unemployment rate is actually much higher. So right now it's roughly about, I'm trying to remember the last number I saw. I know inflation is about 1.1% right now in the U.S. So they compute it every month. So the next one they compute is June 16, I think. As far as unemployment rate is concerned, I think it's about 4 to 5%. I saw the number, I think yesterday, but I can't remember what it is. It's between 4 to 5%. Okay, next we talk about business cycle. Business cycle is like roller coaster. So I'm sure many of you have been on the roller coasters and probably love it. I have been on many and enjoyed it. But I'm getting to the point where I shouldn't be getting on it anymore. Okay, so now if you look at business cycles, so basically you have sort of like the roller coaster effects here. So you have something that looks like that. Okay, so this is your year or your period of time, and this is your GDP. So your real GDP. So the high point of the business cycle, we call it peak. The low point, we call it a trough. So between a peak to a trough, so we call this recession. So recession is a period between peak and trough. So now, so that means your real GDP comes out. So between the trough to the next peak, for example, we call this expansion because, hey, smiling face. You know, your real GDP now rises up to a higher point. So this is a sad phase because when you experience a recession, basically you're dropping. So that's basically that. So what it is we're almost coming to the end here. So if you look at historically, right, some of the period of again, you know, I mentioned Great Recession, I mentioned Great Depression. These were the years that you have lower production, and unemployment rate for these years are basically higher as well. So, but you know, if you look at right after Second World War, right, and the U.S. economy experienced a boom period. So that's your expansion. So a greater degree of expansion we call a boom. A greater degree of recession we call a depression. Okay, again, we are coming to an end here. So what is depression? So I mentioned already that's a greater degree of recession, really. There's really generally no acceptable standard, but most are characterized by severe recession. I think we already know that, right? And so if you look at Great Depression, historically, I think the unemployment rate was about, I want to say around at least 20%, 20, 25% somewhere there. So that's considered extremely high by today's standard because today's our unemployment rate is only like about, like I say, 4 to 5% earlier. So, but the U.S. GDP, basically, I mentioned it's about 17 trillion, but we're experiencing a lot of government deficit because we borrowed so much from China. So it's going to be very hard to get out of this debt, you know. I think eventually we will. I don't know how many years it took because if you look at Bill Clinton's years, actually we experienced a very slight periods of surplus. So because GDP was growing back then. So there were a lot of backgrounds in there, and I think I'll stop here. So the next time I would go to the next chapter. So thank you for listening, and again, I urge you to study in advance and so you could do well on your test. Thank you. See you next time.